you ever had a situation where you know something is in your house and you can't find it, and you look frantically for it, and everywhere you look, it's nowhere that you thought it would be? And the thing is, when you're looking for something that you've lost, what I always find is I find all kinds of things I wish I'd thrown out a long time ago, but there they are. And the one thing I'm looking for, I can't find. So earlier this week, I had to dress up for church because I had a funeral. It was on Wednesday. And I have these black dress shoes that I was looking for. This is the actual pair. And I was looking for them in my house, and I wish I could tell you that I was disciplined enough to take my shoes off and put them in the same spot every day, but that's not what happens. So they end up all over the house. So I was walking around the house. I'm looking under tables. I'm looking behind a couch. They get piled under blankets. I was looking all over my house, and I couldn't find them. So finally, you'd think it's the first place, but it was the last place I looked. I went into my closet. I would love to tell you, just imagine like a pristine closet. Just imagine that. That's not mine, but keep that in your mind. And I was staring at my shoes, all of my shoes, looking for this pair. I was staring at it. Where on earth did those shoes go? And I looked and looked and looked. And I was staring at this one spot. And I couldn't see my shoes anywhere. So then I went out and I looked under my bed. And I went back in my closet and I looked at that exact same spot, and there they were, right in front of me. They'd been there the entire time. But I couldn't see them, even though they were right in front of my face. I was staring at them, but I couldn't see them. I learned that there's a term for this. There's actually a medical condition called scotoma, which means someone who can see all kinds of peripheral stuff, but they can't focus on what's in front of them, so they can't actually see what's in front of them. And it's actually sometimes a neurological and sometimes an ophthalmological issue where your eyes simply can't focus on what's right in front of them. But psychologists have told us that there's also a psychological scotoma. And when you're looking for your shoes, kind of in a hurry because you're running late, and you look all over the house, you can look right at them and not see them because you're so focused on other things and on getting out of the house and being worried that you can't see what's right in front of you. And it happens with all kinds of things. They say that sometimes you can't see things because you have other commitments, other psychological or personal commitments, which makes you unable to see what's directly in front of you. Sometimes psychologists tell us that people can't see what's right in front of them simply because they don't want to see it. Have you ever had something in your life you don't want to see it, so you just can't? The term for that is scotoma. You can't see what's right in front of you. And I think that sometimes in the church, we suffer from scotoma. Sometimes we can't see what's right in front of us. And there's a lot of reasons for it. Sometimes it's because we're focused on all kinds of other stuff, all the things around us. Sometimes it's because our faith challenges us to face things about ourselves, our world, and our lives that we don't want to face. We don't want to see it. And sometimes it's because we have other prior commitments that keep us from seeing the whole picture. And sometimes I think we even do this theologically. And one of the things I see a lot in the church is I see there's this competition. You see, there's some people who want to say that God is love, and it's true. It's a biblical image. It's a biblical sentence. God is love. It's probably the most simple and most direct description of who God is, to say that God is love. But sometimes there are people who are so committed to the idea that God is love that they never examine what it means to say that. Like, they have some internal idea of what love looks like, but they actually kind of reject doctrinal integrity because they say, well, God's love, so doctrinal integrity doesn't matter. But then you have the other side of the coin, which is sometimes you have people who are all about theology, and they're all about doctrine, and it seems like they're so focused on the doctrine or the theology that they actually miss the other important part. They miss that theology and doctrine point us toward the love of God. That sometimes it's almost like theology and doctrine become an end in themselves. And as I was reading this passage and thinking about this sermon and thinking about what this passage said this week, I had this question that kept coming into my mind. I kept thinking to myself, are theology and doctrine always in conflict with the knowledge that God is love? Where is it that these two things come together? Because I think lots of times what we think is well, if we really want to love, we can't talk about doctrine and hold anyone accountable. But on the other side, we think, well, if we're going to hold people accountable, we have to cast love aside because we have to hold to the truth. What if in the scriptures these two things actually came together and actually worked together? What if I told you that you couldn't have one without the other, at least not in any honest way as a Christian? That Christian theology at its heart is actually all about love. And the love of God is actually all about the truth of who God is. I think that our passage this morning actually helps us along in this way. Now, I want to give you just a little preview in our passage. When you read commentaries on this passage, most scholars break it up into two different sections. The first section is verses 1 through 6. And when you read the commentaries, it tells you that this is sort of a doctrinal statement about God. And then you start at verse 7, and it says from 7 to 21 is a completely different section. And in those verses 7 to 21, so that's 15 verses, love is used 27 times. So it's pretty clear what the theme is. And some scholars will tell you that there's the doctrine, and then John shifts gears, and then he starts talking about love. But actually, I think what really happens is he talks about doctrine to set up his conversation about love. He tells us this is who God is in a little bit more of an abstract doctrinal way, and then he turns and says, this is what being a disciple of this God looks like. So we're going to look at the first three verses. In the first verse it says this, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world." So I've told you every week that we've talked about 1 John, I've told you that sort of the story of 1 John is that John and his companions went off and they planted churches as missionaries, and they taught for a while, and they lived among these people, and then they left, very much like Paul's missionary journeys. And then they left these churches, and then other teachers followed in after them, and they started teaching them something different. And John got wind of it and wrote this letter in response because he believed these teachers were false teachers and were leading them astray. So he writes this in chapter 4. He says, "Do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits." Now, we all know, actually, that when you think about like false prophets and false teaching, many times false teaching, at least at the beginning on the surface, has the ring of truth until you dig a little deeper and you ask some more questions and you think about what it's really saying. What John's saying is we need to ask deeper questions when we have teachers who tell us that there's something that's true. He says we have to look a little deeper and ask some more questions. But then he gives us insight into what the question is to ask, and here it is. "By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that is coming. And now it is already in the world." Now, when John talks about the Antichrist, he's not talking about some person coming at the end of time. He's talking about teaching that is against the teaching of the gospel. He's talking about teaching that is against witnessing to who Jesus Christ is. But did you catch what John said the key question is? The Spirit of God, he tells us, bears witness to the fact that Jesus Christ came to us in the flesh. He's telling us that Jesus did not come as a spiritual presence, that knowing the living Christ is not having an overwhelming feeling of God-likeness, but he says that Jesus Christ came in the flesh. That, he said, is at least the first question that we ask about teaching, that if it comes from the Spirit of God, it bears witness to Jesus Christ who came in the flesh. But then after this, after verse 6, John makes this transition and he shifts gears and he starts talking not about the doctrine, but he starts talking about what it looks like. Now, years ago, I read this book by a professor of mine named David Willis. And it was a book on the Nicene Creed. And sometimes when you read about, creeds, and even when you read the creeds, they seem kind of abstract and distant. And he actually argued in his book, he said that when the creeds were written, he said it was actually an attempt to speak concretely about God. And he says, and their goal was always to not say, that's not right. So the goal was always not to say less than the truth about God. Not less than the truth about God. So when John is writing, he says, we don't want to say less than the truth about God, that God came in the flesh in Jesus Christ. But that's not everything. He says, in addition, there's this love piece. But it's set in the context of Jesus who came in the flesh. What he says is, because Jesus came into the flesh, because Jesus came and lived among us, because Jesus lived the fullness of human experience, Jesus knew the joys and the sorrows and the suffering of human experience. He says, because Jesus knew all of these things and lived among us, he in himself has shown us what true love really is. And he shows us what it's like for us to love the world. And what does it mean for God to love the world? It means that God entered into the suffering and the darkness and the brokenness of the world willingly. And he says, this is what God is like. And then he says that God is love. So what John's actually doing is he's redefining what love is all about. Love is actually about entering into the suffering of the world and entering into the suffering of those around us. That is what love is all about. N.T. Wright, commenting on this passage, wrote this. He said, love incarnate must be the badge that Christian community wears. The sign not only of who they are, but of who their God is. What he's saying, what 1 John is saying, is that when we love in Jesus' name, we are reflecting and showing the love and the goodness of God. It's actually a pretty deep and profound theological point. But you see, if John just talked about love in the abstract, it wouldn't have any content. When he talks about it, he talks about the content of Jesus Christ who came as a sacrifice for us. And then toward the end of the passage, he writes this. He says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment. And whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. We love because he first loved us. So in Jesus Christ, we see this image of who God is. Then we're told that God is love. So now we have this image of what love is. But then we have this model, this pattern of how we're to live. We're to enter into the suffering of the world. We're to engage with people. We're to give our lives for the sake of others. Why do we do that? Well, here it tells us because we know that we are first loved by God. When he talks about perfect love casts out fear, he's talking about how, when you have incredible security that you're loved, that you're cared for, that someone is walking with you, there's so much that you could do that you can't do on your own. It enables you to take risks in life. I know I've said this before, but like with children, one of the telltale signs of a child who comes from a healthy and loving home is that a child is willing to take risks. Because a child can go out and they can fail. And they can come back and they can know that they're loved. The same is true for us. That when we know we're deeply loved by God, it gives us the ability to go out into difficult situations and face them, even perhaps to fail, but yet to come home and know that we're loved. As I was thinking about this passage, I was thinking about Martin Luther King Jr. I tried not to use this because I've told you before, but Fleming Rutledge says you can only use Martin Luther King Jr. once a year and Mother Teresa once a year, and then you're done. So this is the Martin Luther King story. So Martin Luther King, it was in the late 50s, I believe it was 1957. He was at home with his family, and there were protests, and there were people outside chanting racist slurs, and he'd been beginning to lead this movement for civil rights. And he was at home, and there was a group of Klansmen who were walking by, and someone later drove by and firebombed his house. And he went and he grabbed his children and his wife, and they went out in their front yard as their house was in flames, and they were losing everything. They were standing in their front yard, and the people from his church gathered around, and the other people from the movement gathered around, and they were standing in his front yard, and they were ready to get guns and pitchforks and go out and fight. And Martin Luther King Jr. stood in his front yard, and he told everyone that was gathered there, he said, "We are going to fight their hatred with love. And we are going to fight their anger and their violence with peace and with compassion." And it was one of those moments when you read Martin Luther King's or his biography, it's one of those moments that set the tone for the entire civil rights movement. Because he said that it was love that would overcome fear and anger. Now, just imagine yourself standing in your front yard. Your house is in flames. You barely got your kids out. You're surrounded by a bunch of people saying something like that. How could he possibly say something like that? How could he possibly call people to live peacefully and to love people who hate them? How could he possibly do that unless he had experienced this depth of love that goes beyond our ability to describe it? Someone who knew that he was held in the hands of God and that anything that he faced, even death, that he would be okay. It's incredible, but I believe it's because he knew what 1 John is saying, that God calls us to face the most difficult things of the world, but to face it with love. Now, I don't think that most of us, or anyone here actually, will probably face something as stark, as difficult, and as severe as what Martin Luther King faced standing in his front yard as his house burned. But I do know that you and I face situations on a regular basis that call for a depth of love that on our own we cannot conjure up. I know that we face situations that are difficult, and our first instinct is not to step toward the difficult situation, but to step away because it's frightening to step into a difficult situation. I know that we face people and lives that are falling apart, and our first instinct is, I don't want to get involved because I don't want to get sucked in, and I don't know what to do. And perhaps this passage gives us some insight. That if we want to be like Christ, we turn toward the suffering and the brokenness of the world. And we do it because we know that we first have been loved and want other people to know that love too. You know, maybe sometimes it's not even like the biggest thing in the world. Maybe it's sometimes learning to see the thing that's right in front of us. And maybe it's even something as simple as like, this week is Summer Friends, and this is going to be a surprise to you, but sometimes working with children is hard, right? And particular children are more difficult than others. And here's the thing, I know it because I know it's true in me. When there's a difficult child, and I don't have any long-term relationship with them, and they're being difficult, my first reaction is to start to walk the other way and think, let's let someone else deal with that because it's going to be tough. But what if this week at Summer Friends, when we welcome way over 100 kids who are not from our church but are from our community, some of them are going to come in here from situations and families that are far more broken than we know. And they're going to act it out when they're here during the week. And we know that. And some of them are going to be difficult. And some of them are going to be challenging. And some of them are going to be super sweet and easy to work with. But what if each night before we come here, we prayed that we would first be reminded by God that we are loved by Him. And then, out of this deep knowledge that we are loved by God, ask God to remind us that our calling is, because we are loved by Him, to love the people that are around us and the people right in front of us and even the most difficult ones. What if, when there's a child that's difficult or challenging, instead of walking away, you just went up and talked to them, or got on your knees and heard what they had to say, or just put a calming hand on their shoulder to help them make it through? What the scriptures tell us is that when we do these simple things with love, it shows through the love of God that's at work in us, and that we are living just as God has called us to live. You know, sometimes we're called to great things. Sometimes we're called to little things. But in everything to which we are called to do it with love. Because we know that we are loved. And when we love others in the name of Jesus Christ, they know that they are loved. And isn't it our goal, isn't it our dream, that the people that we meet, the people who come through the doors of our church, the people in our community would know that they are loved by God, and they are loved by us, and that people matter to us because they matter to God. Friends, not just this week, not just at Summer Friends, but in everything we do, I hope that you start out your day knowing that you are loved by God. And then from that, knowing that God calls us to live like Jesus, who loved the people around him, who saw what was right in front of him, and embraced people in need, and reached out with love. And that when we do that, we become like him, which is what we're called to be. Let us pray.